There are many different kinds of wheels, some gender inclusive, some not. Some focusing on specific identities or intersectionalities like LGBTQIA+ folks, immigrants, or for teen relationships. We recently have adapted to using this wheel because we appreciate its overall inclusivity. This wheel looks a little different from ones we have shared at First Step before, so we wanted to touch on the differences. One difference that you will notice, more sections of the circle and more types of abuse are listed. This speaks to the inclusivity of this wheel. There are not many new types of abuse on this wheel, but types are laid out with much more inclusivity and with intersectionality in mind. Other things that you may have noticed is that physical and sexual violence are not on the outer ring of the wheel, but instead, they are individual sections of the wheel itself. Before we begin, please keep in mind that domestic violence does not discriminate. Domestic violence can impact anyone regardless of their gender identity, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, ability, disability, national origin, and so on. No one is immune to domestic violence. Also, domestic violence is never the fault of the survivor. The only person responsible for domestic violence is the partner causing harm by exerting power and control over the other. Like the more commonly known wheels, power and control is in the center. Power and control is the guiding force for all abusive relationships. Abusers use various types of abuse to maintain power and control over the survivor. It is important to note that abusers will also only use as much force as necessary to maintain that power and control. So one tactic of abuse becomes less effective at maintaining that power and control, an abuser will adapt and begin to use a new abusive tactic. We often see more than one tactic being used at any given time and throughout the relationship. Abusers will continue to use whatever forms of abuse have been effective at maintaining power and control. They will use multiple tactics at once and may increase the frequency of abuse. Another thing to note about abuse is that it rarely ever stops or decreases. Violence continually escalates in severity. Domestic violence is not one abusive incident or merely an unhealthy relationship. Domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. Other terms you may hear are dating abuse, partner violence, or intimate partner violence. I want to discuss physical abuse because when we think of domestic violence, most of us will automatically think of physical abuse with visible injuries. Physical abuse is only one tactic that can be used to maintain power and control over an intimate partner. Here's some examples of physical abuse. It is also important to note not all survivors will experience physical abuse. Like previously mentioned, abusers will only use as much force as necessary to maintain power and control. If an abuser can maintain power and control over a survivor without using physical violence, they will. And those survivors that do may not have visible marks or injuries. Abusers can be skilled at causing physical harm without leaving any marks. Sexual abuse is the other form of violence that is typically on the outside of the wheel. In previous models of the wheel you may have seen. Sexual abuse takes a variety of forms: rape and sexual contact without explicit consent, or more commonly thought of. Sexual abuse is also having affairs and threatening to have an affair, demanding of sex as a form of payment, criticizing someone sexually, and withholding sex as a form of punishment. We also want to highlight a few of the lesser-known types of abuse. One is financial abuse. Financial abuse is another way for an abuser to maintain power and control over a survivor. This can look like an abuser not allowing a survivor access to the household income, giving them an allowance, or by making them account for every penny spent. If the survivor has left their abuser, this can look like the abuser not paying spousal support or child support. Financial abuse makes it much more difficult for a survivor to leave an abusive situation and makes them more dependent on the abuser, giving that abuser control over that survivor. Social abuse is also known as isolation. This looks like an abuser isolating a survivor from their support system, either directly or indirectly. Abusers may also monitor a survivor's car mileage, social media, emails, phone calls, or texts as another way to isolate the survivor from their support system and maintain control over them. We have seen the COVID-19 pandemic impact domestic violence in countless ways. One of those ways is isolation. Abusers have been using the pandemic to their advantage. Abusers will capitalize on a survivor's fear of the pandemic to keep them isolated. Abusers will guilt survivors into staying home and keeping them isolated by claiming it is for the health and safety of their family. Abusers can also provide misinformation about the pandemic to survivors as another way to maintain power and control. Children are frequently used by an abuser to further maintain power and control. Whether the abuser and the survivor are still in a relationship or not, abusers will threaten to abuse the children or will actually abuse the children. Abusers will belittle the survivor in front of the children and try to turn the children against the survivor. Abusers will often threaten to call Child Protective Services or the police to have children removed from the survivor's care. After the abuser and the survivor have separated, abusers will often use child exchanges as a way to continue maintaining power and control, and will often stop paying child support. Abusers will frequently abuse pets and/or a survivor's property to further maintain power and control. Abusers will harm pets or threaten to cause harm to pets. Abusers will threaten to damage property or they will damage property. However, this goes beyond physically damaging items. Property abuse also includes confiscating important documents like a driver's license, car keys or house keys, selling a survivor's items without their knowledge or consent, and controlling a survivor's access to their phones or computers. Spiritual abuse can take many forms, and it is one of the less commonly thought of forms of violence. Before I begin, please note that while the slide itself uses language that identifies one specific faith community, this can and does occur in all faith-based communities. Spiritual abuse looks like the abusive partner twisting a religious text to validate or excuse the abuse and continue to gain power, isolating the survivor from others in their faith community, and using religion as an excuse to not get counseling or to dictate who they will receive counseling from. Cultural abuse is another form of abuse that is less commonly acknowledged. Cultural abuse can look like an abuser insulting the survivor's culture or forcing the survivor to adapt to the abuser's culture. This can also look like an abuser using a language barrier to further isolate the survivor by preventing a survivor from learning the language common to the area, or by preventing a survivor to communicate with others that share their language or culture. Abusers will also use culture to justify or excuse the abuse that is being perpetrated. Psychological abuse is the next form. Gaslighting is a common example of psychological abuse. Gaslighting occurs when an abuser manipulates a survivor, causing them to question their perception of their own reality. One way abusers do this is by saying things and denying they ever said them later, or telling a survivor they made something up or misunderstood the situation. Psychological abuse also includes an abuser displaying weapons, making threats to commit suicide, and controlling what a survivor can and cannot eat. Another form of abuse is verbal. A few examples of verbal abuse are the abuser yelling and screaming at the survivor, body shaming, swearing at, and insulting the survivor. This also looks like an abuser cutting the survivor off during a conversation or talking over them. An abuser may also dictate who the survivor can and cannot talk to and what they can and cannot talk about. Intellectual abuse looks like an abuser insulting a survivor's education, tastes, or beliefs. Abusers will call a survivor crazy or too sensitive. This looks like an abuser playing head games, demanding perfection, and making a survivor prove everything that they do or believe. Emotional abuse can have many forms. Some forms include an abuser withholding affection, using the silent treatment, preventing a survivor from sleeping, stalking, or invalidating the survivor's feelings, or blaming them for everything. Abusers will often display jealous behavior, but will do it under the guise of wanting to protect the survivor. This wheel, called the 13 Forms of Domestic Violence, can be found through a simple Google search, but should have also been provided to you with this video's link. We encourage you to review this wheel on your own time, and even check out other types of wheels available online to learn more about various types of abuse and tactics.